I didn't lose my life in a single moment. I watched it leave, slowly, and did nothing to stop it. That's the part that still haunts me. There was no accident. No betrayal. No sudden collapse that would have justified my regret. My life didn't fall apart. It simply moved on without my involvement. I was present for all of it. And absent at the same time. If you had met me back then, you wouldn't have seen anything wrong. I showed up. I fulfilled obligations. I answered messages. I made plans and followed through. From the outside, I looked like someone who had it together. Inside, I felt like a bystander in my own existence. I remember when that feeling first appeared. It was subtle. Easy to ignore. A sense of detachment during moments that should have mattered. Conversations where I heard myself speaking but didn't feel connected to the words. Decisions that felt automatic, as if they had already been made before I was consulted. I told myself it was normal. That adulthood was quieter than youth. That intensity fades, and responsibility takes its place. I believed that growing up meant learning how to endure life without asking too much from it. That belief shaped everything. I stopped questioning paths that felt wrong but reasonable. I stopped listening to discomfort if it didn't come with a clear explanation. I told myself that wanting more was immature, that dissatisfaction was a failure of gratitude. So I adapted. Adaptation is dangerous because it works. You learn how to survive almost anything. You learn how to function even when something essential is missing. And once you've adapted, it becomes hard to tell the difference between strength and surrender. Years passed like that. Not painfully. Not dramatically. Quietly. I lived inside routines that kept me stable but emotionally distant. I avoided risks not because I was afraid of failure, but because I was afraid of disruption. I valued peace more than truth. Predictability more than meaning. People trusted me. Relied on me. Called me steady. What they didn't know was that I had slowly stopped making choices. I was responding to life, not directing it. Saying yes because it was easier than explaining no. Staying because leaving required courage I kept postponing. Postponement became my lifestyle. I told myself there was time. Time to change. Time to decide. Time to feel ready. I believed that clarity would arrive on its own, like a season, if I just waited long enough. But time doesn't deliver clarity. It only delivers consequences. The first real moment of panic came unexpectedly. I was doing something ordinary, nothing symbolic, nothing dramatic, and suddenly I was overwhelmed by a sense of loss so sharp it took my breath away. Not loss of something specific. Loss of possibility. I realized, in that moment, that many doors had closed while I was busy waiting. Not slammed shut, but gently, quietly, permanently. Paths I could have taken without much cost years ago now required sacrifices I wasn't sure I could make. That realization terrified me. So I did what I had always done when something felt too big. I minimized it. I told myself I was overthinking. That everyone wonders about what ifs. That regret was pointless. That I should focus on what I had, not what I had missed. But the feeling didn't go away. It followed me into everyday moments. Into small decisions. Into the way I looked at the future. I began to notice how rarely I felt anticipation anymore. How often the future felt like a continuation rather than a possibility. That scared me more than uncertainty ever had. Because uncertainty means something could still happen. Continuation means it won't. I started paying attention to time in a way I never had before. Birthdays felt heavier. Milestones felt accusatory. I watched years pass and realized I wasn't measuring my life by experiences anymore, but by endurance. How long could I keep going like this? How much of myself could I give up without anyone noticing? The most painful truth was this: no one was forcing me to live this way. There was no villain in my story. No dramatic injustice to blame. Every compromise had been my own. Every silence, chosen. Every delay, justified. That meant the responsibility was also mine. And responsibility, when you've avoided it for too long, feels unbearable. I began to understand something deeply uncomfortable. I hadn't been waiting for the right moment to live. I had been waiting for life to live itself for me. To carry me forward without requiring risk, honesty, or disruption. To reward patience with meaning. To eventually justify all the time I had spent not choosing. But life doesn't work that way. It moves. And if you don't move with it, it moves past you. I didn't notice when my life started slipping away because it never rushed. It left slowly, politely, without conflict. And by the time I realized what was happening, I had already learned how to tolerate its absence. That tolerance was the most dangerous thing of all. Because once you can tolerate a life you don't want, you stop fighting for the one you do. And that was exactly where I found myself. Standing still. Watching time pass. Letting my life happen without resistance. Once I noticed what was happening, I couldn't unsee it. That was the beginning of the real breakdown. Nothing in my life changed on the outside, but inside, every moment began to carry weight. Ordinary days felt heavy, as if they were asking something of me that I refused to answer. Silence became uncomfortable. Routine became loud. I realized I had been living with a constant internal delay. I was always about to start. About to decide. About to become braver, more honest, more present. But never now. The more I paid attention, the clearer the pattern became. I had built my entire life around avoiding decisive moments. Not because I lacked intelligence or opportunity, but because choice terrified me. Choice meant responsibility. It meant admitting that if my life felt empty, I was partly to blame. So instead of choosing, I adapted. Adaptation is subtle. It doesn't feel like giving up. It feels like maturity. You tell yourself you're flexible. That you're realistic. That you understand how the world works. In truth, I was learning how to disappear without leaving. I started noticing how little of myself I brought into conversations. How often I mirrored what others expected instead of expressing what I felt. I avoided disagreement. I avoided intensity. I avoided anything that might reveal how disconnected I was. Not because people demanded it. Because it kept things smooth. And smoothness became my highest value. But smoothness has a cost. It erases friction, and friction is where identity forms. Without it, you don't break, you fade. The panic arrived quietly. It showed up as an awareness of time I couldn't escape. Every reference to age, to years passing, to long-term plans felt like a reminder that I was spending something non-renewable without intention. I wasn't afraid of death. I was afraid of reaching it having never fully shown up. That fear changed the way I saw everything. I stopped asking whether I was comfortable and started asking whether I was alive. The answers were unsettling. I functioned well. I felt little. I endured easily. That combination terrified me. There was a moment, small, insignificant to anyone else, when I understood how far gone I was. Someone asked me what I wanted next. Not in a deep way. Casually. As conversation. And I didn't know. Not because the question was hard, but because I had trained myself not to ask it. Wanting had become unfamiliar. Dangerous. Wanting implied dissatisfaction, and dissatisfaction threatened the stability I had built my life around. So I shrugged. I deflected. I answered vaguely. And later, alone, I felt a sharp grief for something I couldn't name. That's when the moral dilemma became impossible to ignore. Was I allowed to disrupt a life that worked just because it felt empty? Was it selfish to want depth instead of stability? Did I owe my loyalty to the structure I had built, or to the self I had neglected? There was no clean answer. Staying felt dishonest. Leaving felt cruel. Every possible future carried guilt. The longer I delayed, the more the cost of action increased. Time had invested in this life. Expectations had hardened. Relationships had formed around the version of me who didn't ask for too much. Changing now wouldn't just affect me. It would expose the lie. And that was what I feared most. Not the loss of comfort. The loss of identity. Because if I admitted that this life wasn't mine, then who had I been all this time? I tried to convince myself that awareness alone was enough. That I could remain where I was and simply think differently. appreciate more, want less, accept the limits I had chosen. But awareness without action is torture. It sharpens regret without releasing it. It turns every day into evidence. Every routine into a reminder. I began to feel trapped by my own patience. Patience had once been my strength. Now it was my cage. I realized that I had mistaken endurance for virtue. I believed that being able to tolerate dissatisfaction made me mature. In reality, it had made me numb. And numbness is not neutral. It is a slow withdrawal from life. The most terrifying realization came late one night, when I imagined nothing changing. Not dramatically. Not catastrophically. Just, continuing. Same rhythms. Same compromises. Same internal distance. I imagined myself older, still saying, "It's fine," still explaining away the quiet ache, still waiting for something to happen. And I knew, with painful certainty, that regret would not arrive as an explosion. It would arrive as resignation. That was the moment something in me broke. Not loudly. Not visibly. But decisively. I understood that if I continued like this, I wouldn't fail at life. I would simply never live it. And no amount of stability could justify that. I didn't yet know what I would change. I didn't have a plan. I didn't feel brave. But I knew one thing with absolute clarity: watching my life slip away without resisting was no longer an option. Resisting didn't look like rebellion. It looked like discomfort I stopped running from. There was no dramatic exit. No announcement that everything would change. The moment I decided to resist was almost invisible from the outside. It happened quietly, in the space between one breath and the next, when I realized that continuing as I was felt heavier than any consequence of change. That's when I understood something fundamental: I wasn't afraid of losing what I had. I was afraid of discovering who I might become without it. Resisting meant stepping into uncertainty without the safety net of excuses. It meant admitting, to myself first, that I had been complicit in my own disappearance. That my silence had been a choice. That my patience had been avoidance. That admission hurt more than blame ever could. Because blame allows you to stay still. Responsibility demands movement. I started by breaking the smallest habits that kept me invisible. I spoke when I felt the urge to stay quiet. I questioned assumptions I had accepted for years. I allowed myself to feel irritation, longing, dissatisfaction, without immediately correcting them or explaining them away. It felt wrong at first. Almost immoral. I had trained myself to believe that wanting more was a character flaw. That disruption was selfish. That harmony mattered more than honesty. Letting go of those beliefs felt like removing a foundation stone from a carefully balanced structure. And the structure wobbled. Some people noticed the shift immediately. Others didn't, but they felt it. Conversations changed tone. Expectations shifted. The version of me they were used to, the agreeable one, the adaptable one, the one who never complicated things, was no longer fully available. That came with consequences. Not dramatic ones. Subtle ones. A distance here. A misunderstanding there. A quiet disappointment I could sense but not always name. I learned quickly that when you stop disappearing, you also stop being universally convenient. That was painful. But it was also honest. For the first time in a long while, my days felt uneven. Some moments were energizing. Others were deeply uncomfortable. I doubted myself often. I wondered if I had overestimated the importance of my internal unrest. If perhaps I had mistaken restlessness for truth. But even on the hardest days, something was different. I was present. Presence didn't bring happiness the way I had imagined it might. It brought responsibility. It forced me to confront the gap between who I was and how I lived, without numbing it, without postponing it. And slowly, that gap began to close. Not because everything aligned perfectly, but because I stopped betraying myself in small ways. I stopped agreeing when I meant no. I stopped staying silent to protect an image. I stopped pretending that endurance was the same as meaning. I learned that resistance isn't loud. It's consistent. It's choosing truth when comfort is available. It's allowing friction instead of smoothing everything over. It's staying with questions instead of rushing to acceptable answers. There were moments of grief. Grief for the years I had lived on autopilot. For the doors that had closed quietly while I waited. For the versions of myself that never got a chance to exist. That grief didn't disappear. But it changed. It stopped accusing me and started teaching me. It taught me that time doesn't punish you for mistakes, it punishes you for absence. That regret grows not from wrong choices, but from the refusal to choose at all. That a life can look stable and still be profoundly unfinished. I no longer romanticize the idea of starting over. Restarting your life is not a reset. It's a reckoning. You carry everything with you, the fear, the habits, the consequences. Nothing is erased. But something essential is reclaimed. Agency. I stopped waiting for life to feel meaningful before participating in it. Meaning, I learned, is not something you find fully formed. It's something you build through engagement, through risk, through the willingness to be affected by your own choices. Some days, I still feel the pull of my old life. The ease of letting things happen. The comfort of not caring too much. That part of me didn't disappear. But now, when it surfaces, I recognize it for what it is. Not peace. Avoidance. And I don't judge myself for it anymore. I simply choose again. That's the real second chance. Not a dramatic transformation. Not a clean break. Not a perfect redemption. Just the decision, repeated daily, to resist disappearing. If you're listening to this and you recognize yourself in these words, I won't tell you to leave your life behind. I won't tell you to take reckless risks or burn everything down. I'll tell you something much quieter. Pay attention to where you've gone absent. Notice where you've been patient instead of honest. Ask yourself where you've mistaken endurance for purpose. Because your life doesn't slip away all at once. It leaves slowly when you stop resisting the urge to live it. And you don't reclaim it with one brave act either. You reclaim it the moment you decide that watching from the sidelines is no longer acceptable. I watched my life slip away without resisting for a long time. Until I realized that resistance wasn't about fighting the world, it was about finally showing up inside it. That's when my life stopped happening to me. And started becoming mine.